Welcome to Inspire Campfire, a podcast where ordinary people tell their stories of extraordinary adventure. These are campfire stories meant to inspire the rest of us to light the fire within, get outside, follow our dreams, and return to tell our own stories. Ready? Let's strike the match.
Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Scott Wurzbacher, and today we're diving into one of life's most profound topics, living and dying. Our guest is Niki DiGaetano, joining us from Salt Lake City, Utah. Niki had long been drawn to the idea of working with those nearing the end of life. But in 2022, a section hike of the Appalachian Trail gave her the confidence to step into that calling. After the hike, she told friends, if I could find work that allowed me to listen to people's stories, the good, the bad, the ugly, the traumatic, and the triumphant, it would be the truest work of my soul. That confidence led her to become a death doula, offering emotional, spiritual, and practical support to people at the end of their lives. Through her time in nature, Niki discovered profound lessons on how to live, and she now brings that wisdom to the compassionate care she provides for those facing their final journey. Get ready for an inspiring conversation about life, death, and the lessons we can learn from both. Niki, welcome to the campfire.
Man, that was a really good intro. Thank you so much, Scott. I'm excited to be here. I love talking about this stuff.
I am so excited to have you. This is going to be such an interesting conversation. We've already had one very interesting conversation, and now we get to bring the listeners in on it, and I'm so pumped. Niki, I think for context of the listeners, I'd love to just dive right in and talk about what it means to be a death doula.
Absolutely. So the official definition of a death doula is simply a non-medical support person who helps people at the end of their life, helps patients, helps the families, all that kind of thing. So they're kind of similar to hospice in the sense that they work with the terminal and the dying, except that they never do anything related to medical things, right? Because hospices, there's like hospice nurses, there's always medical, there's always like medications involved, there's diagnosing, there's hospice doctors, things like that. And we don't do any of that. That's outside of our jurisdiction. But what we do is we fill in the gaps. When I was a hospice volunteer, I'm sure we'll get into that, but when I was a hospice volunteer, I remember with the training that I did, the hospice team that I was working with, they had no time at all. They would just rush from patient to patient and they could barely eat lunch in their car. And doulas are great because they have the time freedom to kind of choose like, oh, we're going to take this many clients, and they can kind of partition that out a little bit better than hospice workers can because they just kind of show up to their job and do what they're told to do. And doulas also are more entrepreneurial because it's not really a field that has been widely recognized in the same way the hospice has. So you're not really going to find a job posting for a death doula. You just kind of have to do it yourself. And obviously entrepreneurship, blessing and a curse. But one of those blessings is, again, that time freedom. So we can like spend hours with a patient, or I guess a client is technically the correct word. We can spend hours with our clients, whereas hospice team members can spend an hour at most if they're lucky. But I think my visits are about an hour, but they can be longer if I wanted to. So that's kind of a roundabout explanation. We can help with logistics. We can help with calling up people, making arrangements and pre-planning and such like that. But there's also doulas who specialize in more energetic things, like kind of the hippie woo-woo, Reiki, sound baths. I've heard are very interesting. I know a couple of doulas who do that. And some people choose to find that very healing and very soothing as they approach that time. So I mentioned those things just to give a broad spectrum of the kind of offerings that we can provide.
It's perfect. I'm curious. We're going to get into a lot of this in more detail later. Some of the specific services that you provide and some of the stories that you've had along the way. But how does one become a death doula?
So the pretty simple answer is there's trainings for it. You can just kind of search online death doula training program. And there is a code of ethics that doulas follow, but it's not quite enforced in the same way that it would be for a therapist or a doctor, where there's like a licensing board who can take away your license. Like we don't really have those, but we do have standards we're expected to adhere to. And so you can take a training and you learn some of the core competencies of death doula work. Again, like non-medical care being one of the big ones. Like big no-no, you never stray into that area. You learn some of the basics of how to, like, what it means to be a doula, what it means to sit and hold presence for somebody going through this kind of time in their life. The trainings can all be a little bit different because though they have kind of a core curriculum, they also can vary depending on the trainer. So for example, some might lean more heavily into like the spiritual aspects. Some might lean more into the grief work aspects. It just kind of depends. You have to look and see what feels more aligned to like the kind of work you want to offer as a doula when you select a training.
It's so interesting, and I'm so excited to dive into this conversation a little bit more. So here's the thing. This podcast is about listening to the voice that calls us to adventure. So much of this is about adventure. And, a lot of times what happens when you go on an adventure is you find yourself and you find things out about yourself and you come back a different person. And this is absolutely what happened to you. I think that this episode, this is going to be about living and about dying. And I think that your story starts with learning to live and having this experience of aliveness that led you to this work that you're now doing. And I love the quote that you have on your website that was in the intro, basically saying that it would be the truest work of your soul to be able to listen to people's stories and essentially do what you're doing. And so I would love for you to tell us the story of how the wilderness, nature, and adventure led you down this path.
That's going to be a long story.
Can we start with the Appalachian Trail?
Yeah. So 2022, I went on a 900-mile section hike of the Appalachian Trail, starting from West Virginia, and I went to just over the border of Maine. And that all happened because of a typical, not typical, but a lot of people are on the trail because of life changes, right? And I was no exception. I was going through a rough patch in my relationship at the time. My partner had asked for a break out of the blue, and we had been living together. So I'm like, oh, I don't know where to live now. I guess I spent a month being homeless. So I'm like, well, if I'm going to be homeless, I might as well do it in the woods and have fun doing it. So a couple of years before that, I had gone on a week-long section hike of the Appalachian Trail, but in Massachusetts. And so I remembered thinking about, oh, well, you did it for a week. You can totally do it for a couple months, right? Like that'll be enough time for my dude to decide if he wants to resume the relationship. It'll be some time for you to kind of just get your head clear and figure out if you want to be in the relationship after all this. There have been some underlying problems as well. So I'm like, let's just go. Let's full send this. And so I prepared for the trip in about 2 weeks. I had to hurry up and get some gear because the things I took in Massachusetts were not sufficient. So I went out there and basically I learned a lot of things about letting go of control because I'm very much a control freak. So I had to chill. Mountains don't care about your plans. They don't care if you're a control freak. They're like, yeah, just deal with it. Just your plans are garbage. I'd learned about that. I learned to slow down a lot, which I think is a pretty common theme for people who do these kind of hikes. And it helped me really connect the dots to a lot of things that I had learned from my death doula training and through studying death care that I think I knew back then, like before the hike, but I don't think I really knew it in my bones the way I did after the hike was over. I had a couple of experiences, especially in New Hampshire in the Whites, which is like a really hard section that everybody gets destroyed in. I actually decided to go super slow through there. And it was so sublimely beautiful. And not that we didn't have rainstorms up there and it wasn't hard, but there were a couple of moments where I remember just thinking like, wow, I'm alive and life is good. And I did this. I walked to New Hampshire and I'm almost done. I don't really want the hike to be over yet, but wow, it just, something just clicked in my spirit of, I knew that I felt like I could finally just relax and be. And all my life I had been very hustling and grinding, and I'm sure we'll get into the details of that. Regarding the quote that you had mentioned on my website about the truest work of my soul and stories, that actually happened on the trail. I remember listening to a story of a friend of mine who I was hiking with, and he just was like bearing his soul about a lot of things that were happening to him off trail and just some fears and just trusting me with a lot of vulnerability. And I remember thinking, wow, this is really special. I always was kind of a listener, but there was just something special about being gifted that moment. And the stars were out, and it was just a really pretty night that one particular time. And then there were also just a lot of other stories you get handed while you're on the trail. You're hiking with a lot of people. You hear their tales. I met like a math professor. I met physicists. I met crazy cool people who were 19 years old and just doing this out of college. And I'm like, man, you guys are all so cool. So that's kind of the origin story behind that quote of like the work of my soul, because it just filled me up so much to have that experience while I was out there as well.
Yeah, it's amazing. I really, there's a few things that you just said that I'd like to dig into a little bit more. Namely, and maybe I'm going out of order here, but you said something clicked in my spirit. And I just wonder if you could describe what that felt like and what that experience was like those moments.
There was a lot of crying, like good crying. It was happy tears of like, oh my gosh, this is what life is. It's not to say that we can't be functional adults and have jobs, because I don't mind that so much, but I was having trouble just doing that before the trail and also being happy. And I think what clicked was I was happy, truly and deeply. I was just overjoyed. I was full of life, which sounds kind of, I don't know if I'm real. I feel like I'm circling on what I'm trying to say, or maybe what you were asking me, but it just felt like I was so full. Like, this is the thing that makes people want to be alive, is just this feeling right here of, holy crap, the sun is beautiful. Holy crap, it was raining and now there's like glistening raindrops in the mist. Like, it was just so pretty, so profound. It was so simple, but gorgeous.
It's just so interesting, because this is what nature, this is what this kind of experience does. Like especially when you're out on an extended trip, like the one that you did. But the three things that you mentioned, actually you mentioned two, but I know there's a third one in there because we talked previously, but that contributed to this clicking in your spirit. You said that you had to let go of control. You said that you needed to slow down. And I know you had this sort of success mindset, this like sort of like achievement oriented driving towards success. And I wonder if you could just sort of touch on those things and like how the trail helped you with those things and overcoming those things.
Yeah, I feel like I spent a very long time. So basically all through high school and all through my 4 or 5 years of college, chasing success and chasing achievement and chasing happiness, really. Chasing goalposting actually is a better word for it, because that's what I was doing. I'd be like, oh, well, when I graduate high school, I'll be happy because I did the thing. And then it became, oh, actually, when I graduate college, I'll be happy because then I did that thing. And then it was like, oh, well, I'll be happy when I get a boyfriend, or I'll be happy when we move in together, or when we're married. And it's just like, holy crap, it just goes on and on and on. This constant dissatisfaction with where I was. And when I went on the trail, obviously the boyfriend that whole thing kind of fell apart. And I went on the trail thinking it was, I was planning to actually go to Katahdin. I didn't make it to Katahdin, which is a different story. I was planning, okay, that's 1,100 miles and I have 3 months to do it. This is totally feasible. And the first day out there, my knee got messed up and I was very not okay. It was an injury from the section hike a couple years before 2022. And it was just like reawakening, because it was an overuse injury, really is all it was. Mm-hmm. And so I'm like, oh crap. And I was stuck in a hostel for 3 days in Maryland thinking, oh great, I'm never gonna, actually it was just over the West Virginia border. I'm like, oh, I'm stuck here. I'm screwed. And I stayed there for a day and then another day. And I'm like, I might have to go home like now. The hike's over. I took 3 months off work. And I told my family I was doing this, and now I have to quit on the first day. This is awful. I actually ended up not quitting on the first day. I met a masseuse who was really cool, and she helped me out, and I got out of there. So then after that, I was a little bit more humble. The success of like, oh, let's go to Katahdin. Like, I'm like, actually, let's just go north. Let's just head north, and maybe I'll go to Katahdin. Maybe my knee won't let me. Maybe I'll stop in Pennsylvania when I walk home. I don't really know. So I stopped being ambitious. And then a little while later, about through New York, I was doing a lot better physically, and I got cocky, and the whole success mindset and the whole goal chasing came back. And I'm like, oh, let's go fast. How fast can I hike? How fast can I go? I want to be like the mile crusher through hikers that I see all the time. So I started dialing up the pace, and I was eventually going around 17 to 20 miles every day from New York straight through Vermont. And it turned into a job. Hiking turned into a job. It was no longer this fun thing that I was doing with the cool people that I was meeting along the way. Now it was like, oh, you're working. Get up, hike, go to bed. And no more time for snack breaks or taking your time during lunch. You have to hurry up, because if you don't hurry up, you're going to get to camp after dark. And that got worse and worse as I got further north, and the territory got harder, especially through Vermont. And in Vermont, I had like a mental breakdown of like, oh, I want to go home. Every thru hiker has this point of like, oh, I want to go home. This sucks. I'm tired. I'm cold. I stink. My feet hurt. And I'm just mentally kind of done. Like I was doing okay physically, but mentally I was so done. And it was really because I was going too fast. Because the second I slowed down and decided, yeah, I'm not going to go to Katahdin, I'll just go as far as I want and then call it. The second I let go of that, the hike got like so much better. It actually became the best it was. Like at the end of Vermont and through New Hampshire and then into Maine, it was just perfect. It was no longer hard. I mean, it was still hard, but mentally I was no longer brought to my knees anymore, even though physically it was brutal.
Hey everyone, it's Scott here. This podcast is a passion project for me because I absolutely love adventure. And it's thanks to the effort of my residential real estate team here in Charlotte, North Carolina, that many of you know as the W Realty Group, that this podcast gets funded. This awesome group of people have unmatched levels of competence and caring for our clients. If you know of anyone looking to buy or sell a home, our team serves the Charlotte, North Carolina market, but we can also help you find an agent anywhere throughout the US or Canada through our highly connected network. When you support our real estate business, you are also supporting this podcast. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your referrals. Was there like a deciding point? I mean, I'm envisioning, you just told that story so well. Like you had this success mindset, you kind of let it go for a little bit, but then you healed and you got better. And then you were like right back to that success mindset. And it's almost like you didn't totally figure it out, but then you did. And I'm just curious, like that letting go, was it a moment?
It was a couple moments, and it was pretty big and violent in the sense that I was just like sobbing on this one mountain in Vermont. I don't remember which one it was, but I was sobbing, and I'd been thinking for about a couple of weeks at that point as I ramped up that whole controlling my hike. As I ramped that up, I was starting to think like, dang, this kind of isn't what I thought it was, or maybe it was something cool and now it's not. This kind of sucks. I want to go home. My boyfriend had decided he wanted to cancel the break, and I felt kind of guilty for being out here and not being with him. And I was, again, just the physical challenge of a trail. I was missing showers. And so I just started crying, and I'm like, this is it. I'm done. I'm freaking going home. This is awful. But a friend I'd been traveling with, she was physically breaking down. She was mentally okay, but she hadn't been eating enough. So she also got off trail for the same reason. And so we both looked at each other and said, we're good to keep hiking together, but we both have to slow down. Like we can't keep trying to go 17, 20, 22 miles every day through this territory. We're just going to physically and mentally die. So let's just chill out. And we both chilled out. She ended up getting off trail officially for other reasons, but I kept going. So yeah, it was a moment. It was definitely a moment.
What did the trail do to you, this whole experience? I mean, we talked about these little things, the letting go, the, recognizing the success mindset, these things, but like big picture, like how did this experience lead you on to what comes next, which is like leaning into this calling of working in the death industry?
Yeah, that's a multifaceted answer. So first, I mentioned that my environment before was a little unhealthy. I feel like my other partner didn't really respect the work I was trying to do, because at that point I had become a death doula. I was sitting on the knowledge. I wasn't doing much with it. And I think now that I consider it, it was partly because I was afraid of what he would think. I didn't feel like I had his support. Maybe some of that was a me thing. Maybe some of that was a him thing. Either way, it wasn't conducive to me to step into this very vulnerable stuff, right? So that was part of it. So when I came back from the trail, I ended up breaking up with him. Not right away. I tried to fix it, but we just discovered, I just ultimately decided that we were not compatible. So I ended it. The trail, I think, in the big picture, really helped me. It really gave me courage. It really gave me courage to do a lot of things. It showed me I could do hard things. It gave me the courage to be like, hey, you don't need to cling to this safety blanket of a relationship that really isn't serving you, that you're kind of suffering in. You don't need to cling to that. And in fact, if you can do that, you can also do other things. And if you want to move across the country from Baltimore, which is where I was living, to Colorado, because I was pretty obsessed with Colorado and the mountains at that point. I'm like, I could just do that. I have a remote job, so I was pretty sure that I would have the freedom to leave if I asked for it. So that wouldn't have been a huge transition. And then, I don't know, I think just doing all those things, which were big, big life changes, helped me realize, I've done these hard things. I've done the trail. I'm really proud of it. I've learned a lot. And I can do scary things. I could step out on a limb. I could stick my neck out there. And I feel like death work is definitely sticking your neck out there. like deciding to open a practice and kind of dip a toe into this water. I'd always wanted to do it, but I think I was afraid. I think I had like imposter syndrome before I even had a chance to do the work. It's like pre-imposter syndrome. I think I had that. And the trail helped me kind of knock me out of that. And it also gave me this urgency of like, this is such a beautiful thing you've done. Almost, I don't want to say I have to give back now, but it almost felt like I need to do something with what I've discovered out here.
Yeah. It's awesome. So to be clear, like you didn't find this work on the trail. Like this was something that you were always kind of interested in, and it took the trail to give you the courage and the confidence to go ahead and step into it.
Yeah, I didn't find it on trail. I had known about it, and I had been a doula for 19, 20, 21. I had been doing this or immersed in this stuff for about 3 years before the trail.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about it while I was on the trail. So I had that context going into it, but it didn't set me on that path particularly.
And I'm curious, a little bit of a sidebar here, but like you chose the Appalachian Trail, like you could have done anything. Like you said, well, I'm just going to go do the actual, like, where did your adventure spirit come from? And like, why did you choose that particular outlet?
Yeah. So I grew up next to the Appalachian Trail. I grew up in Pennsylvania, northeastern Pennsylvania, right at the New Jersey-Pennsylvania border. So the Delaware Water Gap of Trail was something I day hiked all the time growing up. I did it with friends as I got older. I had also done that 1 week section hike through Massachusetts a couple years before that. And I don't know, I've just always been kind of a wanderer. I do like solo hiking a lot. So I figured like, I've done it before, I'll do it again. It's just a little longer this time. I like the freedom. I do think there's merits in doing these sort of things with others. And that happened a lot in my long section hike as well. But the freedom of just kind of going out there and doing it and not having anyone to tie you down or bounce decisions off of, just like I can decide to do whatever I want. And this is really fun. I think I've always just kind of had that in me.
I love it. So I wonder if we could go back in time before the Appalachian Trail, because this calling that you had in death work as a death doula was something that came before you went on the trail. It took the trail to really draw it out of you.
Yeah.
But you've always had this calling, and I'm just curious, like if you could talk a little bit about like where that calling came from, like your interest in this kind of work. How did that come about?
All through college, I actually majored in graphic design and marketing, which is currently my day job. But and then after college, I graduated and got hired right away. And it seemed like a really good situation. I also, through the salary, was able to get a nice little apartment for myself, moved out, did the job for about a year, and it was fine. I was learning, and I had the potential to go pretty far with that job. But then I started realizing like a year in, so this would have been early 2019, 2018, I started realizing, man, I'm really unsatisfied. And that kind of goes back to that goal posting problem that I had for most of my life. I'm like, oh, I've done all the things I wanted to do. And you've arrived. You're 23 years old, and just work at this job forever until you die, I guess, right? That's actually almost word for word what I would think, like verbatim throughout my days as I sat in my cubicle and worked. And I was starting to get really panicked over that, and just it kind of spurred up a lot of existential angst, a lot of career dread. It was, I guess, a quarter life crisis before I was 25. And in an effort to kind of quell that, I started looking up all these like self-help podcasts and self-help articles. And sometimes on my Google Chrome feed, it shows little articles about like, just like trending articles. But if you click on stuff, obviously the algorithm will show you things, right? And I would click on self-help related articles, and then the feed would give me more and more of that. So I would look and be like, oh, okay, this is kind of helping a little bit. And then somehow, I don't remember how anymore, but I came across an article about this thing called palliative care biographers. And this was a movement that was starting up mostly in Australia. And what they do is these volunteers would go into palliative care inpatient services, and they would sit and they would record little life stories from the patients. And then they would write them down and they'd put them in a book and they'd give them to the patient. And I thought that was the coolest thing ever. I immediately read that, like, holy cow, you can, this is a thing. I didn't think that I knew about hospice, but I didn't think that there was such a thing as listening to people's stories as an act of volunteerism. And so I immediately, of course, went and looked for that here, but America is America, and we don't have anything like that here yet. So my hope was like, oh my goodness, I need to get into this hospice field so I can start pioneering that in the States. So I told a friend about this whole career crisis. I went to school with him. We were both graphic design majors. And I said, oh, yeah, this is kind of where my head's been at. And coincidentally, I don't think I knew this beforehand, but his dad was the head of recruiting for Beata Hospice, which was they're obviously a national hospice care organization, but there was a branch near me. And he said, you know what, I could set you up with my dad and you guys can meet and maybe you can volunteer. Maybe you'll like it. So I met with him, started volunteering, did that for about 6 to 8 months. And that was right before COVID. So I ended up stopping just because COVID shut me down. But that was enough for me to get my feet wet and for me to understand that, wow, this is really special stuff. Just like sitting at bedside for dying people. Some of them weren't like imminently going to die within the next day. So I'd actually get the chance to forge short-term relationships with them. We would chat. I'd listen to their little life stories. I didn't write them down in a book the way that the Australians were kind of doing officially, but they just wanted to talk. So I got to do that. And I really fell in love with just death care. And that just set me on the path of researching more. So instead of reading self-help articles and self-help books and things that just make me stop being sad, I switched to reading books about death and dying and grief and becoming a death care worker. And that's how I discovered what death doulas were. Mm-hmm. Just like, again, kind of an accident. I don't remember exactly how, but the University of Vermont was offering a training. So I was like, I don't know what a death doula is, but this sounds great. And I am signing up. So I did. And again, just like with hospice, I learned that the deeper I got into it, the more I enjoyed it and the more I felt lit up. There was this one book, it's called Being Mortal by Atul Gawande. I think you and I talked about it on our first phone call.
We did, yeah.
And I'm just going to share the story because I loved it so much. My mom got it for me for Christmas because I just picked it out. Like, this was another death and dying book. Let's get it. And I read it. And I remember to this day sitting on my parents' staircase and like almost vibrating off of the stairs because I was just so, holy crap, this is it. This is the thing that I've been not searching for, but the missing piece that didn't make sense. So yeah, that's kind of how I came to death work. And it's just spiraled since then.
For listeners, can you name the book and the author again?
Yes, it's called Being Mortal by Atul Gawande. It's spelled Atul, and then Gawande is spelled Gawande, I believe.
Got it.
And that book kind of dives into sort of these same existential questions that I was circling around at the time. And it's also a very good deep dive into elder care in the United States.
You said I fell in love with death care.
Yes, I did.
What is that? Can you talk about that? Falling in love with death care. Like what is it about? Is there an aspect of it that just really connected with you?
At its core, death care, I think even you mentioned it, this episode is going to be about death and dying, but also about living. And at its core, that's what death care is. That's what the study of dying is, because when you talk about dying, you're also talking about living in the sense that let's take a hospice patient or let's take a potential client, a doula client or something. When deciding how much care they want at the end of life, like how much like life-saving measures or how much they want to prolong their treatment, you kind of get at questions of their values. Maybe some person might say, I want to be alive and I want to keep receiving life-saving measures as long as I'm still able to talk to my loved ones. But as soon as I'm nonverbal and I'm like comatose, you can just let me go, I'm good. Or someone might say, I don't mind being comatose because I know that they're still there with me. And so that kind of will like dictate different tiers of treatment in a sense, because you're talking to them about what they value. Like some of them might, I think I read a story about someone who just wanted to be able to sit with his wife and eat chocolate ice cream in front of a TV and watch the football game. And that was a value of his. And that was something that he really was like, as long as I can do that, I'm pretty okay. Like I'm not miserable. And so being able to have those values conversations around life for me, I think is super appealing, intriguing, attractive to like the whole death care thing. I also think another reason I fell in love with it is because it helped me and it helped a lot of people that I know who are in this field. They all say the similar things. It helps me come to an understanding of how I can better live. Because before I was goal posting, I was future projecting, or I was looking at the past with rose-colored glasses and being like, oh, the good old days of my teenage years are gone. I'll never have those again. Now I'm just a crusty old washed up 9-to-5 hamster wheel worker. Death work and just kind of the ideas around it helped me kind of sink into actually, dum-dum, life isn't guaranteed. Life is precious. A lot of people die. It can happen anytime. And it's valuable. It's something beautiful. And you need to be able to slow down and sink into that and feel it, not just kind of trivially the way that people are like, oh yeah, death and taxes. I'm like, no, that's not good enough. Cause that's kind of how I was. I was like, oh, death and taxes. Yeah, death, yeah, I'll die, sure. But once I discovered death work and really dove into it, it became like, oh, death and taxes. Like, it's real. It's going to happen. I could like, and also I'd experienced death and loss. Like I had lost my grandparents early on, and I walked through their deaths. I deeply wish that I knew more about hospice and doulas at that time, because I would have handled that situation so much differently.
Yeah.
So I had a lot of regrets there as well. And I'm like, death care is the answer to a lot of these problems.
Yeah.
So yeah, it just seemed to solve a lot of things at once and just offer some beautiful perspectives.
Yeah. In the conversation you and I had a couple of weeks ago, it was very clear to me, and on your website, there's just a lot of you as a person. Your meaning and purpose are very important to you.
Yeah, it is.
I'm just curious, do you feel like you found that calling?
I think so. I think death work and just contemplating this stuff and just applying it to my life ignites my heart in a way that nothing else has before.
Yeah.
I feel like when I discovered this field of death care, my world kind of came back into color in a way that it hadn't been before, which sounds kind of dramatic, but for someone who also suffered a lot from depression for many years, that was a pretty big deal. I know nowadays I'll have sessions with like grief clients, and sometimes even though it's really sad and the things they talk about are heavy and they're crying on the calls, I'll leave my office and I'll be like wanting to dance a little bit and just be like, yes, because it's just so beautiful to be able to feel like you can help somebody, and not through any kind of advice giving or fixing their problems, because they actually hate that, but just being able to listen and receive all of their sadness in a way that most people in their life can't, because they're like, don't be sad. Like literally the lady I talked to today, she was saying things like, oh, I feel so alone because everybody's telling me I can't talk about how I feel and how sad I am. And so it's nice to be able to give her that space and to give other people that space. So yeah, I do definitely think it's a calling of mine.
Yeah. So I want to bring some things together here because, earlier in life, you felt the calling to this, but you were kind of not sure what people were going to think. And then you go and you get on the trail, and the trail gives you courage. It gives you confidence. You come back from the trail, and now we put together a calling that feels like a passion, feels like purpose, and you put together courage with it. So when you got done with the trail, like what happened?
When I got done with the trail, I blew my life up. I came back and I tried to fix my relationship, like I was saying, but I ended up that didn't work out. And so then my next thing was, oh, well, I'm not with him anymore. And he was tied down to Baltimore for a job, but I can go anywhere. So let's go to the mountains. Let's go to Colorado. But I actually ended up picking Utah. So I moved across the country after the trail. I was really sick of thinking on the trail, like, oh, I'm going to go home and it's going to be so flat and a concrete jungle. But I would really like to live among mountains. So I actually met someone on trail who was about to move to Utah. And I was like, the frig's in Utah? It's just red desert. And he's like, oh, no. Like he was showing me pictures of the Wasatch Front where I currently live. And I'm like, wow, that looks like Colorado, but the cost of living is cheaper. So I ended up going there. And after I did all those things and blew up my life and got some space for myself, I thought that question, that success mindset almost kind of came creeping back of like, oh, what now? What you gonna do now? And I'm like, oh, well, I really want to do this death care stuff. I've been talking about it for ages. I've wanted to do it for a while, but what does that look like now? So I started getting a little bit more serious with my social media presence. I had like a death worker Instagram, which I still have, but I started getting more serious about making connections there and talking to people who were commenting on my stuff. And I'm like, does anybody have volunteer opportunities for me? I don't think I can do in-person work right now, but is there a way to be a death doula and do it virtually? And someone actually pointed me to the National Hospice and Palliative Care Organization. It's called the NHPCO, but I think we actually just merged with somebody else. And they said they have a volunteer grief program. And if you want, you could try to maybe sign up with them as a death doula grief supporter. And I'm like, oh, cool. So I reached out to them and gave that a shot. And that ended up working out pretty well. And that's actually who I still volunteer with today. And I can call people, have my calls here. I can reach people nationwide. It's really good. As far as how did I turn that into what I'm doing today, it's still an ongoing project, really. I'm still building my practice. I'm still kind of deciding what I'm doing. Well, not deciding is the wrong word, but I'm still like, I'm expanding my services. Yep. Right now, I mostly do grief support, and I also help people write obituaries and eulogies either after their person has died or beforehand, like just kind of preparing. All that can be done online. You don't need to be in person for that. So I help with that kind of thing. And I really like it because the trail, kind of bringing it back to that, helps me among many things, that gave me the courage and the bravery and the guts, but it also gave me that insight of like, I really want to listen to people's stories. I really, really would like that. I had some beautiful experiences on trail doing that. And if I can connect them somehow. And that's kind of what grief support is. And that's kind of what obituary writing is. You're literally listening to their life story and you're writing it down into 1 or 2 pages. And here's your whole story. And you're doing it creatively, more so than like the funeral home next door will do it.
It's awesome. Do you have any stories that you want to share about your experiences that have been impactful to you, or things that you think that listeners might like to hear in terms of your experience as a death doula?
Don't dismiss the spiritual, I'd say, in the sense of like, I don't really care where you are on the religious or non-religious spectrum, but I think there are things out there that we don't understand. I remember working with a client for grief, and she was talking about how her dad was getting close to dying. I wasn't actually there. This was like a story she was telling me, but I remember she was saying that her father was getting close to death, and he started talking to somebody who wasn't her. He started talking to like a little child in the room, and she says, "Dad, who are you talking to?" And he says, "Oh," and he rattled off the name of who it was, or he described like a little infant, and she got really weirded out at that point because she's like, "You don't know about this, but like I had a child who died," or something like an in utero baby who died, someone who the person should not have known about, but he was speaking to that person, like that person was visiting him. And I remember thinking that and hearing that story for the first time, being just gobsmacked of like, wow, that's crazy. And it's not the only instance. It's not like an isolated event. There's plenty of like near death encounters of people in that liminal space that have been recorded. But it was just really cool to hear it from myself, from a patient, and not just like read about it in a book somewhere. I also was talking to someone, actually, this is a theme that comes up a lot in my work. People will make comments like, life is a gift, hold your loved ones close, because you never know when they're gonna not be there. Because some people have had, been bereaved by sudden death. And even if it wasn't sudden, they're still like, yeah, it wasn't enough time. I don't care how old they were. I don't care if they're grandparent age. I still miss them. I wish I had one more day. So life is special, and please just, don't take that for granted. I want to be present. Someone said it to me today. I want to be present. And I think the trail, I'm bringing it back to that again, really helped me do that, of like, you can be present in the moment, and also you can still work towards meaningful work, which might be another story for another time.
It's awesome. I love it. I guess I'm curious for you, I know you talked about that one person that was having a really hard time and you got off the call and you felt great because you felt that you were able to help that person. But I have to imagine that in the work that you do, it's got to also be very, very difficult. And I'm just curious, like emotionally for you, how do you handle that aspect?
There's like little rituals that kind of help. I mean, boundaries as well. I mean, I kind of go into these things knowing that it's going to be challenging. Sometimes I actually was just reflecting on this the other day. Like I'll walk into a grocery store and I'll see an item that reminds me of something that a grief client was just talking about, that reminds them of their person. And I'm like, oh, I mean, I don't get sad, but I just get a little ping of like, oh, that is sad. And I just like a little prayer, like, oh, I'll just offer this up for them. I can't do anything about it. But yeah, sometimes things like that will happen. I'm thinking back as well to hospice when I was a volunteer. I did have a patient who I cared about greatly. She died unexpectedly, and that was very heart-wrenching. And I knew it. It wasn't like, oh, my best friend died like unexpectedly. This is a hospice patient. She's terminal. She's ill. But it was still a gut punch when it came, and I'm like, dang. And I think really there's a fine line between being a robot and not letting this stuff get to you at all, because then you're not really a human anymore and you're getting kind of calloused, which is a problem. And then there's obviously the problem of like getting flooded and overwhelmed, and like, how do you keep that at bay?
Yeah.
It's kind of a little thing, but like I have this little candle back here, and I always light it during grief sessions or any kind of meetings I have with these kind of clients. And when the session is over, candle's out. I don't light it. Besides that, I wash my hands, and I try to get really present into this feeling of, oh, the cold water's on my hands. It's very cold water. So that kind of shocks me back into my present body. And I'm washing these feelings and this heaviness down the drain, not out of my soul forever, because I still kind of hold compassion for them. But it's like, I'm not going to let this heaviness carry forth into like my interaction with my partner or something, things like that.
That's amazing. I love the way you just described that ritual. Like, it's such a beautiful way of like the self-care and keeping yourself fresh for each of your clients and for yourself. It's important. Yeah.
Self-care is huge for this field. That's another problem with hospice. Unfortunately, it's so sad. Like, those poor people do not have time to breathe, like the caregivers themselves. And it's unfortunate. And doulas, I think, have a responsibility not just to their clients, but also to this field of we're not going to become the next hospice. Like we don't want to be worked out that much. We don't want to be overbooked to the capacity that we just are eating lunch in our cars and we can't take time for ourselves. Like I don't want that for myself.
Yeah, Niki, so this episode is about living and it's about dying. I want to talk specifically about death for a minute because you and I had a really good conversation before this. And a couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to go to the Kingdom of Bhutan, and it was such an interesting culturally. I had some conversations there with local people, and we talked about like the differences between, and not even necessarily the differences, but sort of their perception in that part of the world about death and how different it seems to be there. It's, it's not something that is feared. It's not something that they try to stave off. It's just like a natural part of life. And they do celebrations and they'll actually sit with the bodies for a while. And then like here in the West, like especially in the United States, it's just something that is like something we don't want to talk about. It's something that we're afraid of. It's like we do everything that we can to stave it off. And so I'm just really interested in talking with you about like, the perceptions of death in different parts of the world and just your opinions of that and your thoughts.
Yeah, I think Americans and Europeans, mostly Americans, do a pretty bad job of talking about death and just kind of, we live in an avoidant culture. I mean, at least in my opinion. And so we avoid the things we don't want to talk about, like death. That's scary. We don't want to talk about that. Some people are actually spiritual to the extent that they think talking about death will make it happen. I've heard that before too. Mm-hmm. I think that's actually more of a perception, not so much in America, but in foreign cultures, that they're more of like, oh, to speak of will invoke. So I've heard that too. I have a lot of respect for what the Buddhists teach about death and impermanence. And I'm curious if any of that aligns with what you've heard in the conversations you were having. But I know impermanence is the notion that everything you love and everything you know will die. It will cease to exist. And that includes like me, like you, all of us, all the things we love, all of our items, just everything. It just won't be here anymore. Do you know that they have the 7 meditations on death? Have you heard of that? I think it's a Buddhist thing.
Yeah, not familiar, but yeah, tell us.
There's like 7 different ones, if I'm not mistaken. So there's 7 or 8. But one of them, I think the very first one is, I'm of the nature to die. I'm of the nature to grow old. Everything I love will die. Again, like what I was saying. I'm not quoting them verbatim, but definitely check those out, or the listeners can check those out. And what you do is you're kind of saying those words in your mind, and then you're kind of going into a meditative state, and you're reflecting on those words, and you're asking yourself, does that bring up any tension in my body? Like, am I clenching my jaw now? Is my heart beating faster? Do I feel tightness? Do I feel lightheaded? For most people, the answer probably is yes for some of them. And they're basically saying you're gonna die, but in a couple different ways. And some ways might poke at you a little bit more than others, is kind of what they're trying to get you to think on, to meditate on, to come to terms with. And I think that's a really cool thing that I think is starting to come more into fashion in the States, as people kind of embrace the, not so American phobic stuff that is our hallmark. And I think that's good because it helps us better be able to have these conversations about planning your end of life. What do you want that to look like? Not that you can control the projection of a disease, but ideally, what would you want that to look like? What would you want your care to look like? What would you want your funeral to be like? Trying to deal with all those things after you're dead is such a burden for the family. Like, I remember watching my mother go through that with her parents, and it was exhausting. And that, you know what? Her parents really didn't like to talk about death. Her mother was okay with it, but her dad was not. He was like, mm-mm. So yeah, just the typical attitude. But it's so much different when you can just kind of have these conversations. And to have the conversations, first you have to be comfortable talking about it and thinking about it in your own self before you could talk about it with someone else or your parents, right? So that's one reason I really like the meditations on death and impermanence.
So I'm curious, like, the more you do this work, like, how has your perception or the way you think about death changed?
The other day, I was actually just thinking about whether or not death work can contribute to a bit of anxiety in a doula or a hospice caretaker, because you are around it a lot. Mm-hmm. Whether you're around the bereaved who have lost somebody to violence or, suddenly or whatever, you just know it's there. It's always in your forefront. You can't really avoid it the way other people do. And so I was like, does death work make you anxious? Sometimes my partner doesn't text me, for example, I'll be like, oh, most people will think, oh, he's Is he cheating on me? Is he with another woman? I will actually ask myself, is he fucking dead? Like, does his job, he's construction. So I'm like, does his job site people know to contact me if he's in the hospital because he hasn't answered me for 2 hours? Like, what if he's dead? And so I had to think about like coming to terms with, okay, so there is a little bit of anxiety that probably wouldn't be there if I wasn't engaging with this work to the level that I'm doing it.
Yeah.
It's not to the point where I'm disabled by it. Like, that ping of like, oh shit, what if he's dead comes into my head, but I don't panic attack over it.
Yeah.
But in a way, like I was saying, kind of going back to the whole being human and doing this work and not being a robot, I feel like it would be abnormal to not feel a little bit anxious around death when you do it. And also, paradoxically, at the same time, it does enhance my appreciation for living by being so close to dying. Because I do look around with a mindset pretty much all the time of like I keep saying, life is a gift. And not in that like live, love, laugh way, but in the sense of like life is a gift. Everything about life, even the shitty parts, even my morning cup of coffee, I can make that into a gift by just savoring the hell out of it. And talking to my parents is a gift, even when they frustrate me. And I'm not saying any of this to spiritually bypass or toxic positivity or whatever the word people label things now. It's like both and. Like I can acknowledge that I get frustrated some days with people, but I can also acknowledge that most of the time I have been able to view death as this vehicle to more fully engage with my life and the people in it. And even the little things like walking makes me really happy. Like, wow, it smells so good today. I can just sink into that and not be like thinking about my to-do list. I can just be like, my to-do list can be I'll think about it over here, like an hour ago. But now I'm going to be here. I'm going to be present. And this is great. I'm going to enjoy my walk around town and not think about other things because this is a beautiful moment.
I'm feeling a vibe of gratitude.
Yeah. Yeah. In a word, I warned you I was long-winded. In a word, that is what death has helped me cultivate. Gratitude in a really beautiful sense.
That's awesome. So with that, for people that are listening, like especially as it relates to living a full life in preparation for the ultimate reality of death, what advice do you have for people?
Don't take people for granted in the sense that you can engage healthily with them. I'm not going to start going into toxic people, but don't take people for granted. You don't know when you're going to see them next. Don't put off happiness in pursuit of tomorrow. The goalposting problem that I have. Don't be me. Don't miss time. Try to be present as much as you can. And that presence can be something as simple as, like I was saying, just taking a sip of coffee and feeling the temperature of the mug or the temperature of the thing that's in your mouth. Like, oh, this is really nice. Like, what's the flavor like? Instead of just mindlessly chugging your coffee, like being some presence, cultivating some stillness in that. And no one can tell me they don't have time for that because everybody's like, oh, I don't have time to meditate for 20 minutes. Maybe you don't, but you have time to do that. Another thing I'd say is talking about death. I think it's evident this conversation has been very life-giving and life-affirming and not morbid, because people tend to think that, oh, talking about death is morbid. No, talking about death is a gift. Like, it's a gift to the people you're talking about it with. It's a gift to yourself. And I also would say that things and time and people become more precious when you know that it's limited. Yeah. So like when I moved, for example, visiting my parents suddenly became something sacred. Like, oh my gosh, I'm going to miss you guys so much. I'm so happy to have dinner with you. I'm going to do my very best to be in this moment and not think about the to-do list that I have to do tonight. Like, I want to be here because I know that I'm going to have to say goodbye to you and not see you again for another couple months. Yeah. So yeah, presence, gratitude, groundedness, all of those things.
Thank you for all of that. Huge gift. You're working on a book.
Yes, it's going to be a little bit more organized than this ramble that I've upchucked today. But yes, all the things that we've talked about here, living, dying, some of the insights from my work as a death doula, and also kind of set against the backdrop of my Appalachian Trail hike. Yeah.
So cool. Do you have any kind of timeline in mind for that?
Well, it's New Year's resolution time. So this year I committed to finishing the first draft. I've been working on it, though, here and there for about 2 years, though.
So cool.
I knew I wanted to write a book about death, and then I did the Appalachian Trail hike, and then I was like, oh, no, I want to write about that.
Well, Niki, how can people interact with you, work with you, get in touch, or even just stay in contact and up to date on your progress with the book and the work that you're doing?
Yeah, my website is numbered-days.com. I'm there all the time. Instagram as well, if you're a social media person, numbereddays.doula. Doula, I don't know if for anyone not spelled, DOULA. And the book, I'm putting excerpts on that and also writing about the hike on my Substack newsletter. So that is Niki, NIKILLE.substack.com.
So, epic life story. It's still evolving,
Still
but
going.
you've had so much that's packed in, and just this idea of, stepping out into the wilderness and finding your calling, or finding the courage to follow your calling. It's amazing. And at some point, Hollywood's going to pick up on your story, and they're going to want to make a movie about it. And I want to know, when they do, what's your movie going to be called?
It might be called Heading North. That's the working title for my book.
Nice.
It speaks to the aspect of you're going in a direction, but you're not totally sure about it yet. Not totally
Love
committed
it.
yet. Yeah.
Love it. So cool. I loved this conversation so much, Niki. Thank you so much for all of your sharing. And for those listening, I hope you've been inspired today as much as I have. I hope Niki's story has encouraged you to listen to the voice inside that calls you to adventure, because we want to hear your story next. If you have a story to tell, or just need a nudge to create one, please send me an email. We'd also appreciate it if you'd help us spread the word by leaving a review and sharing or tagging Inspire Campfire in your social media. And until next time, I want to encourage you to get outside. Thanks for listening. Niki, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much, Scott. This was so fun.